My name is Nathaniel Rich. I'm a writer from New York City. I live in New Orleans now. I've published 2 novels. Odds Against Tomorrow is appearing in French. I write essays also about literature and film, and I also do some journalism. But yeah, primarily a novelist. I always had an irrational love for New Orleans. Ever since I visited when I was in college, and I moved there 5 years ago, and I was ready at that point to leave New York. I feel like I'll always be a New Yorker. You can't sort of lose that from your identity. I think probably most people in New Orleans look at me like a New Yorker, but I felt like it was time for me to leave, that I wanted to live and work in a different place. I wanted to be a little bit more outside of things. And New Orleans has been a perfect place for that. And have my own little world in New Orleans. And it's a fascinating city with it's very eccentric culture that I love. But I think it's important for me to not be in New York and to have some distance and some quiet. I think people don't think of New Orleans as a quiet place, but my New Orleans is pretty quiet. It's very strange. I mean, yeah, I finished the novel I was editing the final proofs of the novel right when Sandy hit in 2012. And I moved to New Orleans 5 years after Katrina, and it did affect the way I wrote the novel. I mean, I had finished, a draft by the time I moved to New Orleans, but living in the city, especially for the final third of the novel, which takes place after the flood, living in a city that had gone through that, and that the trauma of the experience was still, you encountered every day. I mean, you still do 10 years later, was instructive for me, and it changed the way I conceived of the final section of the book. I rewrote the final section basically after moving to New Orleans to reflect that experience. So both the persistence of the personal trauma, but also the trauma of the landscape. The city's landscape. It was traumatized in a way. Certain parts of the city had been wiped away. Certain parts of the city had been wiped so clean by the flood that the nature that grew back was different than what had been there before. And there was a kind of post-disaster natural world that was also as different from what had happened before the storm as the human world was different. And so that's something I tried to get at in the novel and informed it. But Sandy did not inform the novel because it had occurred after I wrote it. But it was a funny thing. I mean, in the U.S., when the book was published in 2013, it was right after Sandy, and the first question I would get in any interview or on a book tour was, "Oh, is this your fictionalization of Sandy? Is this your novel about Sandy?" And I'd have to explain that no, it takes me about 5 years to finish a novel, and it was done already. But I think the storm had followed so closely what all of the sort of scientific predictions and modeling had been. I read a lot of reports by government agencies and scientists about what would happen the next time a storm hit New York, and I followed those reports very closely in the construction of the novel, and so Sandy, followed along the same lines as had been predicted, so I actually didn't have to change much at all for it to be realistic. Yeah, I think like anything, it's a combination of all of work I was reading. I sought out work about disaster and but also work about science and math, and I read a lot of biographies of mathematicians. Yeah, I think I thought a lot about White Noise when I was reading the novel by Don DeLillo. I feel like he was writing also about this same sense of dread and anxiety about the future, but in the 1980s, when I think the source of that dread was different. We have more information is accessible, we're inundated with news of disaster every day, not just in the newspapers, but in social media or what have you. And so I think it's changed a bit, but he was grappling with some of the same ideas. And yeah, I read a lot of, roman noir, I guess you would say, David Goodis. And the novel itself is structured a bit like a noir, in that always in a noir you have a character who has some kind of problem and seeks a solution that makes it worse. And then to try to make it better, he keeps getting worse and worse into this kind of spiraling effect. And so there's an element of that in the structure of the novel and what Mitchell goes through. And also Saul Bellows is one of my great sort of models and literary heroes. And he wrote very eloquently about New York, which is where that quote comes from in Mr. Sandler's Planet, but about sort of the modern thought and the way that we think about technology and the way we think about disaster in the future. I think he was very prescient, both in his novels and his nonfiction, about a lot of these ideas. But I really wanted to write a novel that allowed me and allowed a reader to grapple with a lot of these major ideas that we're facing. And I feel like a lot of contemporary American fiction, at least, doesn't allow for that. There's not really any room to engage with big ideas. And I think it's a shame. I think it's something that's been lost. And so Saul Bellow, more than most in his work, he really grapples with ideas. And the trick is not to do it in any kind of didactic, boring, pedagogical way, but to allow a kind of exchange and to ask the questions. And DeLillo does that to some extent too. And so, from a literary perspective, I wanted to write a novel that allowed for that. I stole it, yeah. The film, which is a good film, has nothing to do with the novel at all. But the title, I felt, was perfect, and I felt okay stealing it because it's a better title for the novel than it is for the movie. In English, it's odds. Mitchell is constantly calculating odds of future events happening, and there's this sort of sense of dread in the title, Odds Against Tomorrow, that fit with the novel. And the tomorrow is the future aspect of it. With the filmmaker?
Yeah.
No, that's interesting. Mitchell I had that immediately. It just felt like sometimes you just have a name that feels right. It's a kind of strangely formal, almost old-fashioned name, and he's the son of an immigrant. I think you sometimes have that with first-generation child has a kind of slightly archaic American name. And Zugor, I don't know. I think I like the Z. I don't really...
Because he...
Hungarian. I was looking at Hungarian names. I mean, it's the iconic American city, and it's also the center of the financial world, and the center of American culture. I think even more than LA to some extent, and it's the center of intellectual life. So it seemed like the only place that a book like this could be set, or it made the most sense, especially for the character who's working in high finance. And it has more iconic power, you know. That's why there's such a long history of movies and books about disasters in New York, because of its symbolic power. That was important, but the challenge is then not to replicate all of those other books and not to fall into the cliches of disaster movies. And I tried very hard, very concertedly, to not allow the book to read like a Hollywood disaster movie. That was the danger. And so I did a number of things to try to limit that aspect of it and to focus it not on New York being destroyed, but on very closely on this one character and his experience of things. I think that's true to how we tend to experience disaster. We don't see the big picture. We see the one little detail, or we see the way that it affects our lives. And that's what the novel's about. It's not about disaster, but it's about how we deal with these ideas and how we perceive them and make sense of them, and how sort of disasters and public disasters enter our inner lives. That's what I think a novel can do, is talk about the inner life much more effectively than the outer public life. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, with 9/11, and that's the other thing I wanted to. You can't avoid the sort of shadow of September 11th, writing about New York City, especially when I started writing the novel in 2007. So I think it's sort of subliminally there, but I didn't want to write about it. So I don't even think I necessarily mentioned September 11th in the novel, and I might have to once, but I try not to engage that, because that, September 11th carries with it just this very overwhelming set of associations and personal feelings, and I felt like that would be very distracting to put into a novel. That's why I think a lot of the novels about September 11th fail, because they don't. It's still, whether it's too fresh for the reader or for the writer, our associations, which essentially become like the cliches that we tell ourselves about 9/11, obscure whatever's happening in the fiction. So I was worried about that. It's in the financial world. There was another thing where I started writing before the financial collapse, but that did shape my views of something. But essentially, the first idea for the novel came from a conversation I had with a friend, actually a French friend living in New York, who was working at a Wall Street firm. And we were friends from college. In college, he started a communist magazine, and he was a sort of real political rebel. But then after college, he went to law school and then ended up working at this corporate firm. We would have lunches periodically, and he would be in his suit, and he thought it was his last sort of bit of subversion that he would meet with me and tell me about all the corrupt things that were happening that he was witnessing. And so in 2007, he told me about this very sort of tricky scheme that companies were performing to get insurance, essentially catastrophe insurance, after 9/11 had become impossible in New York. Insurance firms weren't giving catastrophe coverage. And so these firms were going through all these strange legal loopholes to get it. And so even then there was a sense that there was a lot of corruption and slipperiness within the industry, within the world of high finance. There was great suspicion about it, which I wanted to write about. But then a year later, it all came tumbling down, and we started to get a better sense of exactly what the mechanisms were. And it's one of the many forms of sort of paranoia that we have, is that there's something rotten in financial world, just as there's something rotten in politics and so many other things. And it just creates this general sense of dread that things are going to end up badly. really see it as I suppose it has dystopian elements, but I don't really see it as a work of pure dystopian fiction because it's essentially it's set in the present day plus a couple years. Is that I wanted it to feel very realistic and plausible. In the same way that the hurricane that hits New York is not the biggest hurricane. It's not a Category 5, which will hit New York one day, but I guess it's a 3. So it's sort of a middle-level storm. It's the disaster doesn't totally destroy New York. So I really wanted to write about how things are now, and yes, and we all have these sort of anxieties and fears about the future, but I was less interested in trying to play out those fears, which is what you see in dystopian fiction. I was more interested in trying to understand what our fears of this future do to us today, and how does it affect our personal lives, our private lives, our inner lives, our emotional state, to be living in a time where we're constantly forced to contemplate all these horrible futures. And I'm not even convinced the future will be that horrible, but that we live in this kind of period where you can't go through your days without being forced to reckon with these things. I think there's always been an apocalyptic strand of the culture, of all human cultures, and it's sort of a primitive impulse to be worried about apocalypse. And the truth of the matter is we probably had, if you were living in the Dark Ages, say, you had a lot more reason to be worried about the apocalypse for you than we do today. I mean, one of the ironies is that we live in this, what may be the best time in the history of human civilization, at least up to this point, to be alive in, just measured by our, health and longevity. So we shouldn't really have that much to worry about, and yet we're more aware, I think, than ever before of all of the different dangers that we face. And some of the dangers are very obscure and won't likely affect us, but because we're flooded with information, and because of the sort of culture, the way that fear has infected the culture. But then there's also this other new capacity to find out more information about anything that we're afraid of. So like Mitchell, you can spend hours just Googling the supervolcano in Yellowstone and watch every second the different tectonic readings in Yellowstone. Be worried like, is this one that's going to happen? It's really without precedence in human history. That's what's, I think, changed. But yeah, this current you see going back, you see it whether it's in white noise, you see it in the 80s, and you see it all the way through history. I mean, going back to the Bible and beyond to myth. So it's something there, but that's always been there. But our relationship with it is changing and continues to change. It's changing the way we interact with the world. All of us now are in a position where we have to decide what signals to receive and what to block out. And I don't think there's a right answer. I think a character like Mitchell at least begins with receiving every signal and taking everything to heart. And there are also people, in the novel, people like Elsa, who block everything out and just focus on their own lives. And I think most of us lie in between those two. You'd see it in the way we process, for instance, information about the environment and environmental collapse. All the information's out there. The question is how do we respond to it? I think, one of the interesting things since the reception of the novel, in the States at least, has been how it's been taken by, sort of adopted by this people who have an interest in environmental fiction. I think there's a general sense that there is not a lot of literature and not a lot of sophisticated literature about the environment. It's this major transformational phenomenon that everybody has to grapple with, but it hasn't quite filtered into literature yet. I think there are a few different reasons for it. Part of it is the scientific nature of it, I think, is intimidating to a lot of writers in the math, but it's also a generational thing, that the established generation of writers, now there are a few writers who write on these subjects. I mean, Margaret Atwood is one. Ian McEwan wrote a pretty good novel, Solar, about this kind of thing, T.C. Boyle, but they're really the exception, and I think part of that has to do with the fact that they haven't grown up in this new reality, and it's not something that strikes them as intimately as it does the younger generation who will have to live with this. And so the last thing I would want to do is have the novel be prescriptive in any way or dogmatic, and I don't even myself really have dogmatic views about a lot of this, but this is our reality now, and we have to grapple with the knowledge that the world is physically changing at this extremely rapid rate. The manifestations of it are being felt and will continue to be felt in more radical ways. We'll have to live with the consequences of it. And we also know that whatever actions we take now probably won't even benefit us, but will benefit future generations. So there's a very complex moral calculus that as a culture, at least in America, as a society, we've only very slightly begun to grapple with what this means. And I think literature is a place where I don't think it can be very useful in advocating for policy change or political change, but I think it is a place where we can start to make sense of what it means to live at a time when this is happening. That's my hope for the novel, that it can cause some reflection, but I don't intend to tell people what conclusions they should reach.